And there we go. And just FYI, for all of you, I'm in Manhattan. I'm in my niece's empty apartment. She just moved in. She's with her mother, and she lives 2 doors down from my daughter. So it's just like perfect. Anytime I want to visit, she can go visit her mom in Jersey across the river, and I have a place to stay.
Wow.
And so far I've only done 2 loads of laundry and a few errands for them. So, but I haven't cooked for them, although I did bring up plenty of cooked food. So tonight we're going to be looking at the books of Judges and Samuel. And I just want to state, I had in my notes from teaching this another time that I'm going to present tonight, or we're going to see tonight, and you'll hear some of my attitude about people's behavior and the Israelites' behavior and choices they've made. And you should just know that that's really just my view. Certainly if I were within the Orthodox world, the view would be more that God's hand is always present, sort of that idea that, well, you know, Joseph wasn't angry that his brothers sold him into slavery because it was God's plan that, you know, he would then help Egypt and then his family would have a place to be. I don't necessarily take that point of view that God's hand is in everything. So when you're listening, you know, just be mindful of the fact that what I'm saying is an emes. It's not like hard fact. It's the text with a little bit of Amy spin on it. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm also, because I'm not at home, I'm working on one screen and I'm used to working on 2, so it's a little bit more cumbersome for me, but I think I can make this work. Share screen, and I'm sharing this, and here we go. So you should all be able to see that. And let me just get a couple of things organized on my screen. There we go. Now I can see all of you. Perfect. There you all are. Yay. Okay. So let's begin. Of course, I just put this up so you'll see. And of course, if you remember, I did make a change. Let me get my little pointer out. I think it's easier to see than the arrow. There we go. I did this change. So originally today was supposed to be the Books of Kings, but that'll be in 2 weeks. Next week, y'all have a Holocaust speaker. I noticed in the weekly email, so I hope that you'll all take advantage of going to that. Okay, and let's to the next slide. So we're in Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, that's the Tanakh, and we're still in the Nevi'im, the middle third, specifically in the prophets, and we talked about how the Nevi'im is broken into 2 more divisions, they call the former or the latter. And we are still in the former. Last time we covered up through Joshua, and today we'll do Judges and Samuel. And in 2 weeks we'll hit Kings, and then we'll and then I don't remember the syllabus already. So okay, so at the end of Joshua, let me just move this out of the way so I can see. At the end of Joshua, they've conquered the land. If you recall, they finished conquering the land mostly. Right. So we end on this real big high. Oh, yay, the land is conquered. But in fact, they didn't conquer all of it. And all where you see these little round circles, they are other peoples that are still living in the land. Now, don't forget, there is, and it's a very difficult issue for many people today politically, there were people living in that land when the Israelites went in. And it's very unclear to me from reading the text. They didn't always just make war on them. Sometimes there were discussions, but basically they wanted to move them all out of there. And, you know, with all of our sensitivities today about how the European settlers treated the Native Americans and other things today, it's a little bit of a tricky issue. But regardless, it was, you know, more than 2,000 years ago, about 3,000 years ago or so. And it is what it is. Like we can't go back, right? And we can't go back and change that, just like we can't change the colonization of Africa or this country, etc. And I do not believe that this has any bearing on today's Israel politics. So that's just personal. Okay. So there's no central leader, right? If you look back, you've got all the tribes have their land. You remember that Manasseh was on both sides of the Jordan. God stayed on the east side. Reuben did. All the others are on the west side of the Jordan. But there's no leader. They're just this confederation of states, and it's very loose. It's 40 years later. They were in the desert together, but even in the desert, they had splintered. And so there's no true leader. And so the book of, Judges begins first with a review of the book of Joshua. Actually, they review it, it's repeated and it's slightly different each time, which makes us think that it was different narratives that were merged together. at some point. And it ends in chapter 21 with these words, which actually happen often, but this is how it ends, almost like an anonymous cliffhanger. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Ein melech b'Yisrael. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So what's another word for that? I mean, what are they describing here? What's going on?
2 Jews, 12 opinions. I don't know.
There's
Anarchy.
oh yeah, there's that. There's a little bit of anarchy, right? It's you know, if I do what's right and it doesn't agree with what you do is right, but we can both do what we want is right, that's fine as long as we don't clash, right? But of course, you can imagine, of course, there was clashing. And by the end of the book, it is complete anarchy. So, but in between is the main body of the book, which scholars refer to as the cycles. And they go something like this. The Israelites sin. They worship foreign idols, they break some laws, they forget something. And so according to our tradition, God sends an enemy to attack, right? It's sort of like, you know, it's sort of old folklore, but it's not only, it's still true today. People will say, if there's illness in your house, if a lot of bad things befall your house, what should you do? You check your mezuzah. You make sure your mezuzah parchment is kosher, right? It sounds like a baba maisa, but in fact, many people take that very seriously, that if you have somehow erred, that God, the hand of God is going to somehow let you know that. So God sends an enemy to attack, the Israelites cry out for help, and then God appoints a judge, and we'll talk about that term in a second, to help them. And then there's peace for a while, and then the judge dies, because no one lives forever. And then the cycle begins again. And this happens over and over and over. And it was interesting when I was doing some research on this, I found only on Christian sites, by the way, but I found all kinds of really great graphics that show this cycle. And this is apparently, I guess, a very important cycle for many Christians today. It's not something that we often talk about sort of in modern Judaism as part of our rhythm of Jewish life. Although there are those that look at the Holocaust and that it should have been the end of Judaism, but it was reborn. And not only that, but the number of religious Jews, Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, whatever you want to call them, Hasidim also, is larger now than apparently before the Holocaust. So, and there is that sense that there are those, it's not a stance that I would take, but there are those that say that there's an element of that the Holocaust happened because the Jews weren't following the commandments. That's not something I can accept, but I know that definitely within mainstream Judaism that people feel that way. Okay, and so this book, here's what happens in the book of Judges, right? Just going to read these lines from Rabbi Jack Abramowitz. This is from an Orthodox site. But look at these words: foreign occupation, assassination, idolatry, uprisings, apparent human sacrifice, civil war, intermarriage, treachery, prostitution, torture, more idolatry, murder, dismemberment, a bigger civil war, a tribe almost wiped out, and girls seized as brides. That's not like a history to stand up and cheer. Like, this is our history, right? So it's not like a great thing to hold on to. But we have to remember that the stories in this book doesn't take place in a short period of time. It's 355 years. And in this article, Rabbi Abramowitz goes on to say, if you could write the history of the United States, which is only 200 years long, and you see unrest and racism and gangsters, and he lists all these bad things, and you would have the same sense that, oh my gosh, we can't live in this country, which many of us do feel, but hopefully not too seriously. So we just have to remember, but this is a little difficult for us because there are fundamentalist Christians that do look at our history like this, and they look at the ancient Hebrew God as a God of vengeance and a God of war, and how they now, with their new relationship through Jesus, have a very different relationship, and they sort of put us in this box, which is not true and not real, but it does provide for some issues between us. So what is a judge? The Hebrew is the word shofet, and it is, the judge can be referred to as a Moshiach, not Moshiach. So the Moshiach is a savior. Moshiach or Mashiach is the Messiah. Now they're related clearly, and they're even related in the Hebrew. I don't really understand the grammar of how they can change that last letter in Hebrew, but it's not the same thing. And Lehoshia is the word to save, and Mashiach is the anointed one. Actually, it doesn't really mean Messiah, it means one that is anointed. And you'll see, I mean, it's hard to tell because of the grammar rules, but it is a similar shorish, a similar root, but the fact that one ends in an ayin and one with a chet is a major, major grammatical thing. So they're related, but not the same. And shofet in JPS, they call it a chieftain. So not like when I think of a judge, I think of the black robes and sitting like in Law and Order or something, you know, or Judge Judy, right? And when I think of chieftain, that's a whole different role. And a little bit, it's an elder meting out justice and a leader of not only the community, but also of the military. And I think there's one more. Yeah, there it is. And I do think of like the old Westerns, like, I don't know, Judge Roy Bean, or I don't know, not Doc Holliday, but one of those guys in the Wyatt Earp story was a judge. And it's not just about sitting in a courtroom, that it's about leadership. And in fact, in many ways, the judge is the law, right? It's not just that the judge decides the law, but the judge is the law keeper, and make sure that people abide by it. And so this was the role of these judges, these shoftim, in the book. Now, this is a list of them. There's a lot of them that are named in the book. Some of them I'm sure you've never heard of. And the ones, if you can see the shading, the ones that are slightly shaded in are what are called major judges, but it's not clear to me what's major about them, except that that the major ones we have more information. The minor judges, the ones that aren't highlighted, sometimes there's only a line written about them. So we just don't know much about them. And, you know, again, so those words major and minor have different meanings. But we can't really look at the minor ones because we don't have any information. And we're not going to really look at Othniel or Othniel in English because there's very little based on him. He's not very interesting. He was relative of Caleb. If you remember, Caleb was the other guy with Joshua, who were one of the two spies that came back, or two scouts that came back and said good things. And we don't hear a whole lot about Caleb. He's also the only judge from the tribe of Judah, which is in the south. And of course, we eventually become Judah. That's where the word Jew comes from, is because eventually the tribe of Judah becomes the Israelite people. And by the way, these judges do come from, there's some doubles, but they come from a variety of tribes. So it's not like just that the power sits in one area or another. So let's look at some of these judges. So the first one we'll look at is a guy named Ehud, which is, I'm just including, you probably never heard of him, but it's such a cool story that I had to include it. I love this story. He goes up against an evil king named King Eglon. That's this guy here, who apparently was very, very, very fat, like outrageously fat, according to the Bible. And Ehud finds this way to go in and have a private meeting with this judge and stabs him through the gut, and the dagger gets stuck in his belly, and so much so that it's almost consumed by the belly. If you can imagine, like it just wraps around the dagger and it's not seen. And so Ehud then escapes, nobody sees him. And when his advisors and his courtiers come to check on King Eglon, they think he's sleeping. They can't see the dagger because it's stuck in all of the jelly rolls of his belly. And literally, this is what it says in the Tanakh. And when they finally get close, they realize that he's dead. And of course, Ehud is far away. But the Israelites are able to then overcome the Moabites. He's a Moabite king, and because they don't have a king. And kings are very important to every tribe except the Israelite tribes. We have no king, right? All these other peoples have a king. So I really like Ehud. Now, Devorah is the one probably you all have heard of, the one female judge. And she's actually listed as a prophetess, a Neviah. Which says that she has a certain connection with God. Not all the judges necessarily do. And of course, the line of her is that she sits under her palm tree, and the people come up to her for judgment. And she is asked to lead the people into war, but she's not a warrior. So she goes to one of the prime military generals, this guy Barak, and says, you know, save my people. And his famous line, if you will go with me, then I will go. If you will not, I will not. And so they are, two spearheaded power, figurehead. And of course, they are successful. This is a Chagall picture, by the way. It's interesting because I could not find a classic art of Deborah that I liked or that was very clear. But so Barak goes out to war and he wins. However, the leader of the other group is a guy named Sisera, and Sisera runs away. And the story in the book of in the section about Devorah is to me a much more interesting story about a woman named Yael. And it's not clear that she's an Israelite. She's a Kenite, and she's married to a Kenite leader. And Sisera, thinking that he's found a safe haven, stumbles upon her tent and she invites him in and she feeds him, and he gets sleepy, and she then drives a tent peg through his temple and kills him. It's a great story. It's like full of violence. It's great to do with the kids. And there's not a whole lot of explanation as to why she does this. But she's still a hero to us. I mean, she kills our enemy. And there are great classical art pictures of this. I guess the artists really loved the gore, and Deborah wasn't so gory. And then we get to Gidon, or Gideon, as you probably know. In the Hebrew is Gidon. And you may be familiar with Gideon's trumpet or Gideon's horn. It was a Frank Sinatra movie, or Burt Lancaster, somebody was in the movie, which isn't really about the story at all, except for the fact that there are horns involved. So what's notable about Gideon, a few things. One is that he was very reluctant to heed the call. He was called by God to do this, and he didn't want to go, reminding us of so many leaders before him, especially in our brains now, Moses, right? There are a lot of interesting stories about Gideon, but the most interesting probably is his well-known victory over the Midianites. He shows up with tens of thousands of people to go against the Midianites. That seems like a good thing, right? But look what God says. You've brought too many troops with you. Why? What's he? Go ahead and read it. What's God worried about?
That the Israelites are going to claim that it was them and not God.
Exactly. I had a very interesting thing this Passover because I made a little story for my grandson on a PowerPoint like this that I could do from North Carolina, although now I'm here with him. And my daughter didn't want the plagues mentioned, and she didn't want any punishment mentioned, and she really wasn't too happy about God being mentioned. So it was like a little bit of an interesting story. But what I heard myself saying was it really made Moses the hero, which is not what anyone intends. And in fact, that's why Moses is not in the traditional text of your Haggadah. Right? You are supposed to tell the story during the Seder, but that story is not in the Haggadah because we don't want to glorify Moses, that we have to thank God for this. In fact, that's another issue with the story of Purim, right? That God is not mentioned, and the rabbis make sure to tell us that God is hidden, right? Because we shouldn't think that it's all due to Mordechai and Esther. So then he sort of sends home the timid ones, okay, and the fearful ones. So he sends home about 22,000, but there's still too many. And so then he takes them to a water. God tells him to do this, takes them to the water, and anybody who laps up the water like a dog, he can keep for his army. This is exactly what it says. So he's watching everybody, scoop up water with their hands or get cups, but anyone that gets down on all fours and laps like a dog, he keeps them. And there's about 300 of them. And then with these 300 people, which is a very tiny army, right? He shows up with tens of thousands, he's down to 300. They go and they march around the town that they're going to attack with pitchers and with horns, and they make phenomenal noise. And the people inside, thinking it was many more people, are terrified. And at the very end, they don't sound the horns. They're just marching. And at the end, they make this astounding noise. If you can imagine, zillion shofrot, 300 of them blowing, and the pitchers are broken. And the people inside are so terrified that the chaos ensues and they're easily overcome. But it also brings to mind to me, and I don't know how many of you have ever noticed, but when you stay in hotels, at least it used to be, I don't know if it still is, there was always a Gideon's Bible in the drawer, right? I stayed in a lot of Marriott's, and then you get the Book of Mormon, but it's a Gideon's Bible. And so I looked up, what is the connection? Now, first of all, you'll notice in their logo, it's a two-handed pitcher, which is from the story. And it turns out that this organization started in the late 1890s. There were two traveling salesmen in Wisconsin who were good Christians, and they met in a hotel room and were talking and talking and talking. And they decided that it should be part of their mission to share the good word with everyone and to place a Bible in every hotel room. And they started in 1908 in Superior, Montana, at the Hotel Superior. I don't know if it still stands. And they've been doing it ever since. And their rationale, as you can see here, was that Gideon was willing to do whatever God told him to do, have the guys lap like a dog and do this ridiculous attack. And that they felt that they also were doing what God was telling them to do. So it's sort of an intriguing connection to our lives. Now that I stay at a hotel again, it should only be soon, I'm gonna have to look for that Bible and see if it's still there. Then we get to Yiftach, or Jephthah, which is very hard to say. It's much easier to say in the Hebrew. And this is an amazing story and very troubling. He's the son of a warrior and a prostitute. And his half-brothers want nothing to do with him, and they mistreat him. But it turns out he's a very strong leader. He's like a mercenary kind of a guy. And so they bring him back to lead the attack against the Ammonites at this time. And he makes a vow. Now, remember, he's not raised in his home, so he's not necessarily sort of completely part of the Israelite people, but your tribal association is through your father. So he's clearly part of his family's tribe. And it doesn't actually say if the prostitute was an Israelite or not, but he makes a vow. And the vow says that he pledges to God, if I am victorious, then upon my return, I shall sacrifice the first thing that I see to you, my God. And he returns home and he doesn't see his farm animals, and the door opens and his daughter comes out to greet him. And we actually read this story as a haftarah in Chukat, which will be June 19th this year. I happen to know because I'm tutoring a young woman for a bat mitzvah for that weekend. But the haftarah ends before we find out what happens. And in fact, here she is in a classic artwork. She's coming out to greet her father, and he's, distraught that this is what he sees first. And she accepts. She says, you can't go against your vow to God. She accepts this. She goes out to the woods or the fields with a group of her besties, a group of women, bemoaning not her death, bemoaning her maidenhood. It turns out that she's a virgin, she's young, she's not yet married, and she's bemoaning the fact that she will never be mated with a man. And she spends her time in the fields, and then in the text, it says she returns. And then we don't know what happens. It doesn't say he killed her. It sort of looks like he did, but we're not sure. And the commentators actually disagree greatly on this as to whether or not she actually was killed, which is against everything Judaically. You can't even imagine that this story is part of things. But here it is, and it's a fascinating, fascinating story. The story, and she's not named, by the way. She's known as Jephthah's daughter, Bat Yiftach. And that's also an interesting thing in the Bible, who's named and who isn't. If you remember last week when we talked about the conquering of Jericho, the prostitute there that helped them is named. Her name is Rahav, like we know her name. Other times we don't know. We know the names of the two midwives in Egypt that helped save Jewish babies, right? But so many times we don't know the names. Okay. And then we get to every child's favorite hero, Shimshon or Samson. And boy, it is not the story they tell you in Sunday school. This is one of the classic ones that is just like, whoa, when you actually read the text. He is, I love this quote from My Jewish Learning, hardly an ideal role model or savior. He breaks vows, he marries outside the people of Israel twice, and functions more as a vigilante than a leader. And he's not too bright. I mean, it's very clear when you read the text that this is not a very bright guy. So where does he come from? He was born to a man named Manoah and his wife, Hannah, she is named, who was barren. Again, a recurring theme throughout the Bible. In today's Jewish community, we're dealing with fertility. Many say it's because women are, a predominance of Jewish women are professionals, and so they're waiting longer to get married and have children, and that's what many say is the issue with fertility. But if you look throughout the Bible, it's a constant refrain. So Hannah is barren, and but she's told by a messenger of God, very similar to the Sarah story. And by the way, we read this as a haftarah, this story on Rosh Hashanah. When we read the story of Abraham and Sarah hearing that they'll have Isaac, the haftarah is this story where Hannah hears that she will have a child, and she's told he will be a Nazarite. So what's a Nazarite? A Nazarite it's like going on retreat. It's almost being like a monk, but not for life, except in the case of Samson. But it's for a period of time. You take a vow to be a Nazarite, and you don't drink, and you abstain from sex, and you basically are out there on your own, like literally like a spiritual retreat. Sometimes it was at penance. Sometimes it was for some other great event in your life. But it definitely was there was a structure to it, and there are others that were Nazarites. And Samson, but this is a little unusual because they're told he will be a Nazarite. He finds, of course, as many of you, as you know, the story of Samson, that he has superhuman strength. There's a great story in here where he tears apart a lion barehanded, and he also, there's a story where he protects the Israelites from the Philistines time and time again, but one was a battle where he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, right? So there's all these fantastic stories. But Hannah, I want to get back to Hannah for a second. She is a fascinating character because she goes on her own, not with her husband. Did I skip that? Anyway, Hannah was one wife of Manoah. He had another wife named Peninnah, and Peninnah in the text was not nice to Hannah, taunted her because she didn't have children. And Hannah goes to pray at a place called Shiloh, which was a place of sacrifices when the temple wasn't yet built. There was no Jerusalem yet, and Shiloh was a place where the law resided, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, the Ark of the Covenant. And she's praying, and she's talking to herself, praying, like her mouth is moving. And the high priest Eli assumes that she's drunk, and he chastises her. And when he realizes that's not the case, not only does he bless her, but we take the way that we daven from the story of Hannah. Like most of us don't do it this way. We read silently. But if you go to an old shul, all the men are mumbling, right? Their mouths are moving and a little bit of sound is coming out. And that is from this story from Hannah, that she was this role model of how to pray from the heart. And Samson works alone, no armies, is vigilante, and he's very successful until the whole Delilah episode, which is a story that we do know. And there's a great, by the way, I found a great comparison between Samson and Hercules. So if you know of children or grandchildren or neighbor kids that are into like superheroes, it was a really fascinating article, and you can Google Samson Hercules, that showed how either they're both made up and it's based on folk tales of the times, or maybe the Romans took their ideas of Hercules from Shimshon. We don't know. There's a picture of, as you know, Delilah in the story. Most of you are familiar with the story. Let me just make sure I'm on the right page. That she, yes, I numbered the pages to be so organized, and I went in the wrong order. How about that? Okay, back to Hannah just for a second. I take it back. Hannah is later. Hannah is not Samson's wife. Manoah's wife is not named. I apologize. So everything I told you is true, except put the Hannah stuff on hold. And he goes to Delilah, he's in love with her, and he has a wife. He has two wives, actually. He has one Israelite wife, one non-Israelite wife. And he's in love with Delilah, and she's convinced to find the strength of his powers, you all know. And after several tries, she eventually learns that he's not allowed to have wine, which he does have every time, but he's not supposed to cut his hair. That's another thing. The Nazarites don't cut their hair. And she cuts his hair, his strength, like in a cartoon character, he loses his strength, and the Philistines conquer him. Now he ends his life in captivity. This is a very interesting shot here. This is actually Norman Rockwell, of all people. And he did it for I think for a movie or something with Victor Mature.
Yeah.
And this is a Norman Rockwell print. and he ends his life. His eyes are plucked out. He's in captivity, has no strength. But because he's in captivity for so long, his hair grows back. And of course, he's not drinking wine, and his superhuman powers sort of come back. And as he's shackled, watching the Philistines torture Israelites, he calls on God for strength. That's an important part, that he calls on God for strength. And he was able to push down the pillars near him, and the building collapses and kills all the Philistines. So our sages look at Samson in different ways. He is a hero, but he's not a great hero, right? And it's a very interesting thing in literature and in life. You know, I just recently saw a TV movie about Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was flawed. And in many ways, this is a Bill Murray who played Roosevelt. It was a really interesting piece about some neighbor woman that he had an affair with, not the woman that the big affair that he had, but they're all flawed. Even, you know, even the best of our leaders. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, not Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson now, right? All this, they're finding more and more things about the slave woman that he apparently had children with. And so it's a difficult issue, this issue of leadership and of hero especially. So they paint him, I love this, Talmud debates the true character. One Mishnah paints him in a negative light, that his eyes were gouged out for punishment for following the desires of his eyes, right? What a poetic punishment. But how could he be punished when God's actually behind him, right? So he is, for the most part, held up as a hero. And we know we don't tell the children about his flawed character, but I think it's important a little bit for children to understand that there's no such thing as perfect. I think it allows us to accept flawed leaders a little bit better, and they are, after all, human. Oh, I'm sorry, missed one. And the book ends here at the end of Samson with that line, "There's no king." Right? And the people are bereft. They have no leadership. That's never been consistent. The longest of the judges, I think, ruled for 40 years. Some were only like 7 years. And then there'd be a period of chaos. And when they fell into chaos, of course, they were liable for attack. So that brings us to the book of Samuel. And Hannah is Samuel's mother. I'm so sorry I put this out of order. Originally, there's Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. Originally, the two books were one, and they actually were, and so it was the same thing with the book of Kings, and they actually were put into one book of all reasons because, because of a printer's issue. The Septuagint first treated them as, the Septuagint first divided them up, but then apparently when Daniel Bomberg in Venice in the 16th century started printing the Hebrew Bible, he printed them as two separate books, and it stayed that way ever since. The book of Samuel, the first book, can be divided into 3 sections, Eli and Samuel, and it's Eli who is the high priest that I told you about in Shiloh. Again, I'm sorry for confusing you. Then we have the episode of Samuel and Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel. And in fact, King Saul and David, primarily their story, are discussed in the books of Samuel, not in the books of Kings. And then Samuel and Saul, and then Saul and David. And part 1, this is the part I was telling you about before. I apologize again. He had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah has children. Hannah's childless, and Hannah was the one that would pray at Shiloh, where Eli was the priest. So who is Samuel? Well, his name means God listened. The El is God, and Shema, right? The word we know, listen, O Israel, hear, O Israel. So Shmuel, God heard. And so Hannah named him that because she prayed and God heard. And she gives him into service for God, right? Like most of us with a firstborn son, 30 days later, there's something called a Pidyon Haben, and you redeem your firstborn back from service to God. Hannah did not redeem him. She had promised him to God. So he's given to Eli, and along the way, we're told that Eli's children are not fit to be priests. By the way, Samuel's children also are not fit to follow his footsteps, right? So we do not necessarily have an issue of father to son in this. In fact, we don't, Moses' children, right? They weren't given leadership in any way, shape, or form. Aaron's children, some of them were flawed and were killed because of their flaws. So we know that Eli's children are not going to take over. And Samuel is raised in the temple, well, not the temple, but in Shiloh with Eli. And there's this episode where that they decide that, actually Eli's sons decide they're going to go up in war, and they think, well, if God is really with us, then we'll win. So they pick up the Ark of the Covenant, this, like the Ark of Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of thing, this box that holds the 10 Commandments, and they take it with them to war, thinking that it will scare off the Philistines. But in fact, it doesn't. And the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines, as well as Eli's sons. And actually they're eventually killed. And Eli hears this. This is a great story. This is what it says. Eli hears the news of his son's death and of the Ark of the Covenant being captured. And I quote, "He fell off his seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck broke and he died." So it's like he was so shocked that he fell off his chair and died. And then Samuel sort of steps in Eli's place, and they eventually get the Ark of the Covenant back. There's a very interesting episode in this has to do with hemorrhoids. All the Philistines are attacked with hemorrhoids. That's what it says. And because Samuel is the leader, he is now acknowledged as the next judge or leader of Israel. But there's this one little line in here that I just wanted to show you because it always tickles me, that this is about his daughter-in-law, who's going to be, is pregnant, going to be delivering a child. And when she hears that the ark was taken and her father-in-law died and her husband died, as long as her brother-in-law, she goes right into labor early. And about that time, they said, don't worry, you're having a son. And she names the boy Ikavod, or in English we'd say Ichabod, which means without honor. Because for her, the honor had left Israel. And we know, like, I think you're probably all familiar with Ichabod Crane from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And that, what was it, Washington Irving wrote that book, I think.
Yes.
And not only did he know his Bible, but he was also not only great friends with, but rumored to be very in love with Rebecca Gratz, who was a Jewish woman in Philadelphia who started basically Jewish education in this country. And so he knew not only his Bible well, but he knew the text well, and he opts to name his bizarre, anti-hero Ichabod. So just thought I would throw that in. It's one of those little tidbits, trivia tidbits. So now Samuel is ruled a judge, and everyone looks to Samuel. But he also grows old, and his sons also do not follow in his ways. And then we have this very intriguing piece in chapter 8, where the people say to him, "You're old, and your kids are not going to take over after you, and we need a king." And Samuel doesn't want to say yes to a king. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, now again, it's a little bit of which came first, we're not sure. But in Deuteronomy, there's a section in chapter 17 that says, if after you've entered the land, the people want a king, you can do it, but know that the king is going to tax you and take your sons for their warriors and take your wives as slaves. And it goes into this whole thing in the middle of Deuteronomy chapter 17. And basically, that's exactly what happens in the book of Samuel. We have something that they call the King's Charter. And Samuel says the same thing. Whether he learned it from Deuteronomy, whether Deuteronomy was added afterwards to justify a failed monarchy, we don't know. But it says he's going to take your sons into battle and your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He's going to take your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, and he will tax you, which of course all happens. And page 8. Okay. And Saul is appointed king of Israel because God said to Samuel, "Saul's your guy, go and appoint him as king." Now, Saul proves to be less than perfect, hugely flawed, perhaps a touch of mental illness, and doesn't follow exactly what God asks of him. Specifically, he does not destroy the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites are people that the Israelites first met in the desert when they were leaving Egypt during those 40 years. And it's the one place where God says, destroy them all, every man, woman, and child, and all of their livestock. Destroy them. and the Israelites do not destroy them fully. They are victorious, but they don't destroy them. And the Amalekites come back to be a thorn in the side of Saul, and Saul also does not kill them. And in fact, a little bit we call professional courtesy. He specifically allows the king to continue to live. And the king is a guy named Agag. And Haman, you'll remember, is an Agagite. There's a relationship in our text between Haman as a descendant of these Amalekites. And there's this very gruesome episode. Because Saul doesn't kill him, Samuel says, bring Agag to me. And you'll notice in the bold, it says, Samuel cut Agag down before the Lord. Well, the Hebrew is a little bit more gruesome. He basically chopped him into pieces to say that we are wiping them out. But that was just the king. The other Amalekites were left to live as well, including Agag's children. But Saul, due to episodes of madness perhaps and whatever, it's clear that he is not to be king, and God deposes him. And Samuel goes and appoints David at God's behest while Saul is still king. And it's a lot of intrigue in this. In the meantime, you know, probably David was a young man in Saul's camp. He had played the harp. Maybe he killed Goliath. Not everyone believes that. And he wrote the Psalms, except nobody believes he really wrote all the Psalms either. But he was clearly a poet and a singer, and was best friends with his son Jonathan, right? So Saul and David clearly have a love-hate relationship, because Saul then goes after David to kill him many, many times. It's like an obsession. Maybe because he saw, maybe it was like a little bit the Betty Davis movie All About Eve, where you can see this young kid coming up and they're going to take the throne from you. But it's a fascinating read, but a little disturbing. And it brings us to the second book of Samuel, where we see David as king. And I will mention to you that I view David's kingdom a little bit like I view Camelot. It's a lot of wishful thinking. It's a lot of, oh, we make it look so nice. But in fact, it wasn't so nice when you read the text. And we'll talk a little bit about how David came to this position that we have him in today. We're raised on the song, right? David, Melech Israel, we all sing it. We believe that the Messiah will come from the house of David. Now, when that was determined, I don't know. And well, there's maybe some politics at work in rewriting some of the text to make David look better in later times. David, the poet, the giant killer, he unifies the kingdom, but I'm here to tell you he doesn't really unify the kingdom. And then he can't build a temple because he's a warrior. I mean, how great could he be if he's not even allowed to build the temple? And not only is he a warrior, but you probably are all familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba, where he sends, he sees a woman, he's smitten with her, he lies with her, she's pregnant. And so he wants the husband to come back from the front lines, you know, to quick lay with your wife so that it'll look like the baby belongs to the husband. But the husband is so pious, like, I'm in training, I'm not allowed to have sex. So he refuses to sleep with his wife. And David decides basically to send this man, Uriah, to the front lines where he'll surely be killed, and he is. And Bathsheba becomes the child, unfortunately, which is very sad. The child, I don't remember, dies during childbirth or dies soon after, but that child of that union, of that illicit union, does not survive. But Solomon, who eventually will be king, is Bathsheba's son, but not the one from this union. And succession just is not as easy as we're told. It doesn't go from one to the next. In fact, when David dies, his sons fight against each other. Major war amongst them because it's such an uneasy household. There's basically turns into a war between the house of David, which is in the south, and the house of Saul, which is in the north, because there's still a son of Saul living. There's a few sons of Saul still living. And as at the beginning of David's demise, the house of Saul wants to now come back into power. And with David, we meet Natan Hanavi, Nathan the prophet, not a big name you've heard of, not as big as Eliyahu. He doesn't get a door opened for him. He doesn't get a song. But this is a new type of prophet that we meet with Natan, and I call them the prophets of conscience. Oh, I didn't mean to go there. This prophet, this kind of prophet, I think of them as Jiminy Cricket from the old movie. He sits on the shoulders of a king and whispers in his ear, don't do this, do that, what's right, what's not. It's sort of like if you've seen the commercials, the cartoons do this all the time, right? Where there's like an angel on one side and a devil on the other, or the evil inclination and the good inclination, right? That we talk about, Yetzirah Ra, Yetzirah Tov. But I really think of these prophets as Jiminy Cricket. They're to keep Pinocchio on the right path, and they fail sometimes, but they're there as the conscience to remind them of what's right. It's not just about military power, it's about what's ethically correct. The Bible is Shakespeare, Shakespeare is the Bible. All of these stories, as I think I mentioned before, as I read them, I think Shakespeare. Now, of course, it's really that Shakespeare knew his Bible and was writing plays on similar themes, or maybe these themes are just the themes of humanity. And so in early Britain, where Shakespeare was and was writing, you're seeing the same kinds of intrigue and backstabbing and jockeying for power that we saw in the Bible, because it's part of human nature, which is a little bit of a sad comment, because I don't know that we've come all that far, but that's another issue. Sorry, Bathsheba is just one of David's failings. There's rape, there's incest, revenge, more. David's son, his own son, seeks to take the throne away from him. It's a very sad story. You may know the line, "Oh, Absalom, my son," that David, even though he's fighting against Absalom, is praying that his son will not be harmed. It's his enemy, but it's still his son. And the North still does not support David. So David unifies them, but it's not for very long. And the book ends with continued strife between them. So I want to, but David is an interesting character. We'll talk not as much about him as I'd like, because I grew up loving King David, right? I think we all did, but he's incredibly flawed. And I've gone to class after class, lecture after lecture. How did it come to be that we raised David on a pedestal, as Michelangelo does here in his famous statue? And there are many that believe, and we'll get to the book of Chronicles in our last session, that Chronicles was rewritten, or was written, it's like a summary to paint David in a better light. Because he doesn't look good when you read these books of Samuel. He looks terrible. And he's a womanizer, and he's ruthless. And there's not a whole lot of things to like about David, and yet it's King David, right? So 14 things you should know about King David. He might not have killed Goliath, right? So they differ on this a little bit. And by the way, the slingshot, if you don't know, is not one of these kind of slingshots where you pull it back and let go. It's one where you like put a rock in like a handkerchief and you swing it around your head and throw it. That's more. And yes, we know that rocks can kill people, right? You throw a rock off of an overpass on a highway onto the car below, and we know it kills people, right? But regardless, he was both hero and anti-hero. He was a stud, without question. That he was fair to behold. There's a discussion about whether he and Jonathan, Saul's son, were involved in a homosexual relationship. I don't read the text that way, but I do know people in the gay community do hold that text very dear, because they feel that they are there represented in the text. And when he comes back from fighting a war while Saul is still king, the women are just throwing themselves at him. I mean, this is a constant refrain in his narrative. The bisexual part, it's so scandalous that it had to be censored. And again, this is about the Chronicles thing, that when they later go to write the book of Chronicles, it seems that they knowingly changed the story. Now, what made them think that people would read Chronicles more than they would read Samuel, that I don't know, right? But it was important enough for them to change the narrative. This was very interesting to me. Apparently, Richard Friedman, who wrote the book, who wrote the Bible, he's a professor, at least he was, I don't know if he's retired yet, down at University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. He lives in Atlanta, though. And he hypothesized that this whole narrative, as well as others, were written in a female hand. Again, that's literary criticism way above my pay grade, but Dick Friedman generally knows what he's speaking about. He was the youngest of 8. Now, this is an interesting fact. Can you think of a time where the firstborn in our history is the next leader?
No.
Right? Isaac is not the firstborn of Abraham. Jacob is not the firstborn of Isaac. Joseph is not the firstborn of Jacob, right? And Moses is not the firstborn, right? We have a narrative of the firstborn not following in the dad's footsteps, so to speak. We have a narrative of a younger child. And like, to make it even more drastic, he is the baby of 8, which is, you know, maybe a little bit overkill. But it's an interesting issue when you look at it. Like, why would, like, I think the law of average would say that at least sometimes the firstborn would be the hero or the next in line, and it never happens. David's mentioned more than 1,000 times now. I don't know how many times Moses is mentioned, right? I didn't count this. This is from an article. But the author of this piece said we should be called Davidism instead of Judaism, right? That it's astounding how many times his name appears when it's really only confined to several books, and that he is held up as the king. Still today, we don't, well, Saul clearly had a falling from grace, but Solomon did not, as we'll see. Solomon doesn't fall from grace, but we don't talk about King Solomon all the time. We talk about King David. Now, the speak truth to power has to do with Bathsheba. Speaking truth to power is a phrase that's used that you courageously confront an authority. So call out injustices. And he does not speak truth to power. Nathan speaks truth to power to him. Nathan's not afraid to go up in front of him and say, David, you sinned, you did bad, you did wrong. Now, to his credit, David does acknowledge that and does try to do some penance in the stories, but it's something that can never go away. Just because you say you're sorry doesn't make the initial wrong disappear, right? And that's a big life lesson for all of us to know. You thought Thanksgiving was tense in your house. I like this line. Nathan's prophecy to him is that, it's basically to David, is that you will suffer. And it proves true. One of David's sons rapes his own half-sister. David's male offspring, like Absalom, go to war against him. Nothing goes well for David. And according to the hand of God theory, this is because of his treachery with Bathsheba. And really, you can't imagine a family gathering, right, with that crowd. And David created history's first hit list. When he dies, on his deathbed, he calls Solomon to him. Solomon is, again, not the firstborn, not the only son, but he's the one that David chooses. And he literally gives him a list of people that Solomon should seek out and kill after David's death. It's like watching The Godfather, right? He's sitting there and listing the names of all the people that Solomon should kill.
Was he really that good? Was he really that good looking? I mean,
David, well, according to the text, he was fair to look upon. He's the first figure in the Hebrew Bible for whom we have archaeological evidence. And that's sort of an interesting fact, right? Nothing confirms the existence of the patriarchs or matriarchs, Joseph or Moses or Saul, but the discovery of an inscription on an ancient stone, and this discovery was only made in 1993, seems to confirm that David was, in fact, a flesh and blood figure. So that's sort of a cool little tidbit. And Jewish tradition says he never died. Now that sort of took me by surprise because he's on his deathbed. We see that he's on his deathbed. Elijah's the one who never dies. But apparently it's a long tradition in both Judaism and Christianity that he will live forever, both in the bloodline of the Messiah, right? Because the Messiah will come from the house of David, and for the Christians in the bloodline of Jesus. And in the song that we sing, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam, David will live, I would have said will live forever, V'Kayam, but the translation here says David, King of Israel, is alive today. And so when you see Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, fervently singing this song, A, it's a Messiah song, and B, it's a little creepy, and C, it goes to their, I mean, I don't want the line of David, right? David's too flawed for my tastes. I think we have better models to look at. And he was a pop star then and now. And of course, you know, the Leonard Cohen poem that was turned into a song. He turned it into a song and everyone has covered it recently. It's actually not my favorite. It's not such a great song. Actually, when you look at the words, it's a great melody, that's for sure. But it's a difficult song. When I was maybe 14, Leonard Cohen's book, I remember the name of it, but I don't remember the name of it, was a hit. I went to camp in Canada. Leonard Cohen is from Montreal. One of his cousins was in my age group. And so all the counselors, all the hippie counselors were very much into Leonard Cohen and his poetry. It was much more popular in Canada than it ever was in the States. But that song now is part of everything. People sing a Donald Lum to that tune, and people sing, you know, all of Hallel to that tune. Apparently more than 300 versions of the song have already been recorded. So yeah, he's a pop star. He was then and he is now. Okay, so that is it for our books of Judges and Samuel. I think the next slide is going to be, oh no, the next slide is just our date. We're in 2 weeks. And I do want to remind you that next Thursday will be the program with, well, Michelle, you can probably speak more about it. I just read it in the newsletter.
Yeah, it's Rabbi Apple is going to be joined by Reba and John Alper, because Reba was born in a DP camp. Her mother was a survivor of Auschwitz, and so was her father. And so it's basically, and Rabbi Apple has taught at the community college here in Wilmington for several years, quite a few years, about the Holocaust. And Reba has done a lot of education, as did her mother before she died several years ago. So it's a program. It's not a service, but Amy, you're certainly more than welcome to join us next week. I think it'll be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it will as well. I think the Raleigh Jewish community has another program that I'll probably be attending. But just, you know, to make mention, you know, it seems a little harsh for us. We have Passover, and then boom, it's Yom HaShoah. And then the next week, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, Israel's Memorial Day and their Day of Independence. Now, why is Yom HaShoah when it is? Well, when it originally started, it was not Holocaust Remembrance Day. It was a Remembrance Day for the ghetto fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto. Mm-hmm. And the date of, I believe that either that it started the uprising or that it fell, was in April. And it fell in Passover. And when Israel became a state, and they very much they were not looking at victims. They were looking at more than just survivors. They were looking at people that defied the Nazis. They were building a state they could not build as a group of broken survivors. They had to build as a group of resistors and people that were strong. They were Maccabees, right? They were not beaten up Jews. And so they wanted to celebrate the heroes of the ghetto. And when they discussed it, I think it was 1951 that they were discussing it in the Knesset, and they decided that they didn't want it during Passover, so they moved it to just after. And that's why it's so close. It's to that connection to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which is an amazing, fascinating story. If you're not familiar with it, there's books and movies about it. And then Yom HaZikaron is Israel's independent Memorial Day, which they have the night before their Independence Day, which is so fitting and so understandable that you can't have independence without the sacrifice, and you can't celebrate your independence without acknowledging the sacrifice. You know, here in this country, both Memorial Day and July 4th have very little meaning for most of us. But in Israel, it's still very close to the heart, and they're still battling for their country. Clearly, there's, you know, not a person that lives in Israel, not a Jew that lives in Israel, and probably not an Arab that lives in Israel either, that doesn't have a connection directly to the episodes leading up to 1948. And that's a day that's just on the calendar. It's the day that it was. And there's a lot of discussion about having it during the counting of the Omer, which we do from the second night of Passover until Shavuot. You're not supposed to have celebrations, but whatever they, as Jews, we work it out somehow. So we
Amy,
worked out. Yeah, please, Diane.
I have two things. Why do you think, maybe there isn't an answer? I mean, not only Judaism, but other groups put such stock on the firstborn. Yet, as you stated in the Bible, none of the firstborn become the big guys. And it's like Pigeon and Ben, I mean, there's all this stuff about the firstborn, and yet it doesn't come through that way from the text. It's very interesting.
It is very interesting. And I know that there are psychologists that have looked at it from a child development point of view and place in family. There are all these studies on your place in your family. I, by the way, am the second out of 4. Yes, you're right. 4 children at Seder. That's me, Russia. And to my knowledge, there's nothing definitive. But I mean, I guess to the Christians' credit, Jesus was, I think, the firstborn of Mary and Joseph, or Mary and whatever. But yeah, there's no one in our tradition that's a firstborn, that's a hero or a leader. And I feel a little bit sad for the firstborns about that. Again, as I said, law of averages, there should be at least one.
Right.
But and then later on in in European history, right? Wasn't the firstborn inherited everything, right? And the secondborn went to the priesthood or something. And
usually the next in line to be king or queen or whatever.
Totally.
The other thing too is that I've always looked at the Bible or the Torah or any of these texts as not what we should be doing, but what we shouldn't be doing.
It's a very good point.
I look at it going in that direction instead of this is what this is the roadmap to success. They're saying this is the roadmap to disaster. Now choose,
That choose, exactly. I apologize. I'm going to need to run because I have another meeting that just started. So I'm going to go. If you all want to stay on and chat, you're welcome to, and I will see you for sure in 2 weeks.
I think one of us would need to be host in
Yeah, I
order
can
to be
do
able to
that. I
stay on.
I
So
can do that. There. Okay.
no. Well, where we are, I guess where one of us is a host. The only thing I would make sure everybody is aware that if you didn't see today, the Jewish Film Festival announced its lineup for the virtual festival this May.
Right.
And you can get that from their website if you haven't seen the direct email.
It's also in the newsletter.
And it's in the newsletter. Thank you.
So everybody should.
And do you want to go to services in person tomorrow evening or Saturday or Sunday? Please sign up online.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Can't imagine sitting in that sanctuary. Just can't.
I'm so torn between wanting to go and not wanting to go.
Well, I can tell you, Ruth, there is enough space that you could not come in contact with
No,
anyone.
there's a couple reasons, and it's not because I've only had one shot, but yeah, no, I'm probably will. I wanted to make sure there's room for other people, but I'm pretty sure I will do that.
There's still plenty of room on all the services. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But
Naomi, I know you won't drive at night, Naomi. Will you be able to be there Saturday morning? Oh, you're on mute, honey.
Sure.
Hang on. There you go.
No, unfortunately not.
Okay.
But I guess it was a little bit of a shock that we were going to do this so quickly. I need weeks.
You've got to be comfortable. You got to be comfortable.
exactly.
Well, when you're ready, let us know. And if you want to ride on a Friday night, I can't offer you yet because I don't have my second one, but once I do, I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You can't trust me even during the day. I tried to go to Costco and ended up on I-40. So
Well, that's an easy thing to do. That's
That's actually pretty easy from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still recovering from that.
Oh my gosh. Anyway. Well,
I'm just not comfortable yet.
she's got so much information. What were you
What'd you
saying?
say, Anita? I didn't hear you.
I'm just not comfortable going in yet, but I probably will in a while.
Yeah, you take your time. There's no rush. We'll be there and it'll be on Zoom.
That's
I
right.
haven't been to Costco in a year.
It looks the same, whether it's here or Myrtle Beach. It's
Yeah.
Wow.
All
Well,
right.
I'm gonna need to go. I apologize for being off screen, but I managed to make homemade applesauce and latkes while you all were learning.
Ooh,
I was
okay.
listening.
Wow.
For
Well,
the,
I'm going over Ruth's house.
Yeah, really.
Well, it's homemade out of a box, but that's the way I grew up. My mother made it that way, so.
All right. That's okay.
but it
We'll take
works.
it.
I'm going to eat supper.
The applesauce I made homemade, but it is all gone. We have devoured it, and
All
I'm gonna go clean up.
right, guys. Good night.
Good
See
night,
everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Good night.